Okay, welcome everyone. Today we're co-hosting a dialogue with Reality in Mind and Vimarsha Foundation, which means we have more people than normal. It's going to be a wonderful chance to exchange views from these two amazing perspectives. Then just to extend a very warm welcome to both Sthaneshwar and Bernardo this week. Um, for anyone that doesn't know who's joining either from one community or the other, Dr. Sthaneshwar Timalsina is a traditionally trained and authorized lineage holder within the Sarvāmnāya Order. The pronunciations will be corrected in a moment, I'm sure. A chaired professor specializing in Hindu studies and comparative philosophies and religions at Stony Brook University, and he founded the Vimarsha Foundation as a global forum for the study and practice of classical tantra. And Bernardo Kastrup is leading the modern renaissance of metaphysical idealism, the notion that reality is essentially consciousness based on analytic philosophy and including evidence from physics, biology, psychology. So we've had one dialogue with these two incredible thinkers before. This time, as it's co-hosted with the Vimarsha Foundation, I met with Ravi, who works with Sthaneshwar earlier, and we talked about some of the themes that we'd invite for discussion. And Ravi, if you're here, you can unmute. Ravi is a professor, a scientist, and meditator at Temple University, and he'll introduce some of the questions that we'd love to hear your thoughts on Bernardo and Sthaneshwar.
Yeah, thanks so much, Amir. And I'm really excited about this conversation. One of the things that's most exciting is that so often, I think both groups can experience this, is that we spend so much of our time questioning and refuting materialism that we never get a good chance talking about different forms of idealism. And so now the fact that we're starting with two idealists, wow, it's like we can actually get started where we want to. So just to set the stage and to get us all on the same page, I'd like to quickly hear from first Bernardo and then Acharya on what is your one major refutation? If you had to say, here's one major problem with materialism, what's your go-to critique? Just to get us on the same page, and then we'll move forward into discussing and debating different types of idealism. So first to you, Bernardo.
Physicalism cannot make sense of the sole given fact of nature, which is the existence of mental states. It creates this abstract new category, which is non-mental state or physical state, which is defined basically by exclusion. A physical state has no positive definition in science or philosophy. It is defined simply as something that isn't mental. That is ultimately what you get. So it invents this new category and then says everything is that, and the mental somehow emerges from that which is fundamentally not mental. And in trying to do that, of course, it fails to account for mental states, which is all we ever have. So it's a non-starter of all the metaphysical options on the table. It is by far the worst ever engendered by the human mind.
Acharya, please. Same question.
I would trace a Shastra because I'm not defending my own philosophy like Bernardo. I'm mostly trained in Kashmiri Shaivism, Trika philosophy. So, यथा न्यग्रोध बीजस्थः शक्ति रूपो महाद्रुमः तथा हृदय बीजस्थं जगदेतत् चराचरम्. So rather than translating, I'd like to give you the essence of it. That just like an acorn seed, the example here is the negro, like the banyan tree. Just like this, within seed lies the tree in the form of the potential, the same way within consciousness rests the entire world. So materiality is a particular mode of being, as is pure consciousness, yet another. Like I would call avastha, situatedness. Like I myself am awake now and I may go to deep sleep, and in the deep sleep mode of my existence, I'm not conscious of all the facts around me. The same way, materiality, you could consider that a deep sleepy state of that being entity, a singular entity. So now coming to physicalism, physicalists have posited that consciousness is an emergent property, like Bernardo already said. And if you read Dennett, actually, consciousness turns out to be an illusion. So, like, there's also thesis of self-illusion. So they have posited something as consciousness to be diametrically opposite to materiality in order to reject something. So, and then for that, they need consciousness to reject. Any affirmation or rejection depends on consciousness. So there are multiple problems here already. So nothing diametrically opposite comes out of anything. As far as we call upadana karana or material cause, there has to be some form of homogeneity, some type of genetic continuity. That's where we have the material causal relation we can build. And consciousness, they said, they posited, is an absolutely different type of entity, a different category. That I do not agree. There are just only one thing that exists, and I have no problem if you want to call that a matter or consciousness. These are just words, because this, if there exists just one thing, and that one thing manifests different properties in different occasions, in different situatedness. And so our situatedness, the mind in this case, would be being situated within the body. So because we have this higher sophisticated processing we have of the neurons, and we are able to the process consciousness to have concrete ideas, thoughts, imaginations, fantasies, and so on. And but in essence, these are all different reformulations, reconfigurations of a singular entity. Like Bernardo gives in his book, the example of the whirlpools, the different configurations. I have started reading your book, Bernardo.
It's
So,
an honor.
so
It's
yeah,
an
but
honor.
we can continue on that. But this is basically that there is no reason for us to assume two types of entities, two types of realities, and then to reject one type that you say emerges out of completely diametrically opposite properties, and then but in the essence doesn't exist. So there is this like too many problems, logical inconsistencies there. Thank you.
Yeah, that makes sense. And so both of you are sharing the idea that there can't be two fundamentally different types of things. And what you're suggesting is that using different metaphors, so one would be the idea that the way that a seed contains the potentiality and then it emerges out, or you have water and then the water can whirl into a whirlpool, but the whirlpool is ultimately coming from and of the nature of the water, that this consciousness is fundamental. So this is something that so far you seem to share. But there's a sort of question that then somebody would ask, which is that, well, if this consciousness is fundamental, why does it arise? Why does the seed turn into a plant, or why are there whirlpools at all? Does this consciousness will the world into being? Is there some sort of purpose behind this manifestation of our materiality? So, Bernardo, in your works, you've basically likened consciousness to a field, and a field that has excitations. And you've suggested, if I understand you right, that without these excitations, consciousness can't really be aware of itself. And you talk about this model borrowed from dissociation, dissociative identity disorder, where you say this whirling is like a dissociation that produces these individuals. These individuals essentially evolve mental capacities. And then that is the way that the consciousness can come to know itself, come to be aware of itself. So, can you tell us a little bit more about your view? Is it that this fundamental consciousness wills for dissociation to happen? Is dissociation something just kind of incidental that just happens to consciousness? How does this all arise? That's the big question.
Okay. This is a very big question. I have to give you half a book in one answer. So let me do my best to do it as succinctly as possible. The first thing to notice is that all we have ever been acquainted with are mental states. even the so-called material world around us, insofar as we can access it, we access it in the form of mental states. The things we see, touch, smell, feel against our skin, and so forth. Now, there obviously is a world beyond our private minds. When I park my car in my garage in the early evening, when I come back from work, the car is still there next morning when I wake up to go to work. And it was there even when I was asleep and dreaming. So there are external states. There is a world out there. The claim is that that world, although not part of our personal, individual minds, might as well be mental. We don't need to postulate something other than mental states. You are having thoughts right now. Those thoughts are mental states. I do not have access to those thoughts. Your thoughts would still be there even if I were not here, even if I didn't exist. Your mental states would still be there. So it's not strange to think of mental states that are not ours. Anybody else's thoughts are mental states and they are not yours, and you're okay with them existing. The same goes for the external world. It may be mental. It's just not your mentation. It's mentation out there. So that's the idea. Now, how does this division between mental states out there and mental states in here arise? This is well known in psychiatry as a well-studied, well-understood phenomenon, largely understood phenomenon called dissociation. It's when certain mental states do not have a cognitive bridge to access other mental states. When you forget something that you know you remember and that later on you do remember, that moment of forgetfulness is a dissociation. When you fall asleep at night and you dream and you think that you are your dream avatar, not the rest of your dream, you are dissociated because you are the entire dream. But during the dream, you think you are just your dream avatar and the rest of the dream is out there and it's not you, even though it is you, obviously. That's a dissociation. The claim is, this is exactly what's happening right now. We are dissociated from the world, just like your dream avatar is dissociated from the rest of the dream, even though you are doing the whole dream. You're doing the entire thing. Now, with all this said, for dissociation to arise, for a world to happen, for phenomena to unfold, for things to happen, for there to be events, this superset of mental states that we call nature must be self-excited. It must be able to excite itself, to induce its own activity without an external stimulus. Now, whether you are a physicalist, an idealist, a dualist, self-excitation is always necessary. Even if the world is physical, it's still self-excited. Self-excitation led to the Big Bang and to everything that has happened ever since then. All the quantum foam events, the spontaneous rise and disappearance of virtual particles in a vacuum, all of this is self-excitation. Idealism uses the same idea, but it's a self-excitation of mental states, which is the only kind of states we know to exist and we have access to. And now, finally, to address your question, is this self-excitation spontaneous or is it deliberate? You used the word will. Schopenhauer used the word will in a manner that also makes room for spontaneous events. Like you don't deliberate, you just will spontaneously, like instinctually, like a cat wills to go to the water bowl and drink water. It's instinctive. And the lower you go in the animal kingdom, the more instinctive it is. So the question is the rise of nature, the Big Bang and dissociation, the entire phantasmagoria we call existence, is it spontaneous or is it deliberate? Was it planned out? Was it decided to be brought into existence? The honest answer is I don't know, but as an analytic philosopher, I will err on the side of caution and say, just like everything else in nature beyond higher animals like ourselves and whales, elephants, and some mollusks. Everything else in nature is clearly spontaneous, instinctive. So I would put my money on the whole thing through and through being spontaneous at a fundamental level, and the emergence of deliberation, which requires self-reflection, being a sort of evolved mental function that is the outcome of the evolutionary process on this planet, as far as we can know. In other words, at the beginning, there was no deliberate planning, there was no consideration and deliberate choice making. The nature did what it did because it is what it is. It's just spontaneous. Like we dream spontaneously. We don't plan our dreams. Mind unfolds itself to itself spontaneously. We know that. We don't choose our emotions, otherwise none of us would suffer. We don't choose our dreams. My money would go, in terms of being cautious, I would place a bet on the whole thing being spontaneous and deliberation being an evolved later mental function.
Thanks so much. That's really clarifying. So just to recap, a bit of what I heard is that for you, will is closely linked with deliberation, and these are evolved capabilities. So these aren't things that would be there kind of at the get-go. Um, does this at all relate? You talk about it as sort of necessity. It is what it does. Does this relate to this question that's come up before with the desire to know itself? Is that related at all to the necessity that there's some sort of reason for the manifestation, which is so this mind, which can't know itself prior to manifestation because it lacks the self-awareness, then produces it out to know itself? Is that part of your model?
It can be. There is room for it. By the way, I'm comfortable using the word will in both the spontaneous sense and in the deliberate sense, and in the same sense that Schopenhauer uses the word. But we know what we mean. I think it is entirely possible, it's not contradictory at all, to imagine that nature at its most fundamental level unfolds spontaneously, but still teleologically. Goals can be spontaneous. Goals can be instinctive. Animals are goal-directed. They know when they need to go to the puddle and have a drink of water. They know when they need to mate. They know when they need to eat. They know when they need to seek, some shade and take a nap. And we wouldn't claim that these things are deliberated. They are just spontaneous actions that emerge out of spontaneous instinct, will, whatever you want to call it. Amoeba build little houses out of mud particles in the puddles where they live, like little shells that protects them. Paramecia go after food and run away from danger. So there is nothing contradictory about the hypothesis that nature is both instinctive / spontaneous on the one hand, and goal-directed, teleological on the other hand. And that telos, that goal, might be self-knowledge. And there may be a sort of a gradient of potential that pushes nature spontaneously towards that instinctive goal.
That makes a lot of sense. And I see a lot of overlap and also some differences with the Shaiva view. So, Acharya, one of the distinctions would seem to be that in the Shaiva view, consciousness is always fundamentally, intrinsically self-aware. And it's not that manifestation, it's rather that manifestation kind of occurs within this self-awareness rather than manifestation occurring for the sake of self-awareness. So there seems to be a critical distinction about what we're positing is the nature of this absolute pure consciousness. And so I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about that and, what this means for how we understand like the dissociation process and whether you align with this understanding of will and the notion of freedom and how those sort of relate to what Bernardo's just talked about.
Thank you. For that, I'll need to give you a little brief of the metaphysics from Abhinavagupta's perspective. First of all, what we mean by consciousness is this luminosity we call prakasha, that being aware of like self-awareness or the awareness of the things in the world, that any instant, any event of consciousness, any event of luminosity is intrinsically, inherently, reflexively aware of itself. So there is not just a luminosity like that of the light or a torch, for example. That's just like, because a torch is not self-aware. A mirror has a reflection, but mirror is not aware of what it is reflecting. Consciousness, on the contrary, is not just simply reflecting things like a mirror. It is self-aware of the reflection within itself. So we call that swabhava. What does swabhava mean? What I think, like spontaneity, we sometimes there is an overlap. They are not like really identical. The word spontaneity like reminds me of swabhava, but then swabhava is not exactly what he's using for spontaneity. So this beingness, positedness, selfness. Swa means self or itself, itselfness. What is the mode of being as such? Is the mode of being as such is this luminosity that is inherently reflexively aware of itself. But this reflexively being aware of itself underlies two additional categories. I can't, as if within this metaphysics, I can't just simply be aware. There is just this will within me to be aware, icha. So this volition is always inherently, intrinsically there. And this icha is, we call wonder, chamatkara. It's not the determined will, like a directional, having a specific horizon, because it's intrinsically, inherently there in singularity. So we could not have a predetermined horizon in Merleau-Pontian term. So, but since it's a spontaneously willing to be, and this willing is not separate from being, and that is where its swatantra, freedom, comes into play. So what does this swatantra or freedom does is, in the field of singularity, the only thing that could happen is multiplicity. So almost like in Gilles Deleuze's vocabulary, singularity means plurality, or you know, it's this is one is many. Basically, the oneness of Shiva is the manifoldness of the world. But how does it happen? Is in this swatantra, there is almost like a monotonous being. If there is no playfulness. So we have the vocabulary, we call that the deva. We have translated as God, the deities or something, but the original meaning of the word is luminous, but at the same time playfulness. The consciousness is deva. It is luminous and it is playful. So what is this playfulness? To multiply, that's the playfulness. To become many. And what happens in the process of actualizing manifold is we determine the horizon, and there's like each and every center starts determining the horizon and then excludes itself from the rest of the field, and that determined horizon becomes the subject, and then there comes multiplicity. The rest becomes the field, the object. Like you have your own horizon of determined field of consciousness, that is the subject, but for me it is the determined field within this location, and so you are an object. So there arises a field of subject and object within that singularity, and that is a process of Ananda. Ananda is not just joy, you know, mostly, or bliss, I don't know the word. Why it is not like that is because the word is derived from two nadi samriddha, from the word nad. Ananda is derived from nad, which means to progress, to be fulfilled, to be enriched, and that sense of growth is not there in just smiling. There is a sense of growth in multiplying, so that we start multiplying, we start becoming many, and then this manifoldness immediately requires the self and the other horizon, because I need to recognize you, not always just me. Otherwise there would not be manyness. So therefore we create these what to say, boundaries, if I may, and we use the word kanchuka. We create these boundaries, and in these boundaries we separate ourselves and treat as objects the other. But almost borrowing the word from Merleau-Ponty, I would say there is no real separation between the subject and object, just like in the tactile, like I can be the touching subject or the touched object. It's a matter of the way I can feel. Like, when I'm touching my hands, I am the subject touching, and I'm also the object being touched. So that's how we can experience. We can extend, like my body. My body is the experiencing subject. The same way my body is the object. I'm having experience of my body. So the world is my body, in the sense that the world is the subject. I'm experiencing the world. I am the world experiencing, and I am experiencing the world. And in that case, the world is an object. So the real teleology, because we brought that, the real teleology is how to reverse the process. How from this finite embodied situatedness of a star to a different situatedness, to experience totality as myself, to feel all of you as myself. So but it does not erase your beingness. So you enjoy your own being. Just because I experience you as myself doesn't stop you from experiencing you as yourself. So in totality, we call the enlightened yogic mind as the mind that experiences the entire world as his own body. Whereas other subjects have their own finite self-experiences. But this, because to become a yogi is also to attain swatantra, freedom. So that doesn't mean that once you experience the totality as your own being, you can never come back to this embodiedness. No, of course not. You have that freedom now. You have the choices. You have now no choice, basically. So you are finitely limited within the body, and not even within the body, because most of us, or almost all of us, are not always conscious of our body in the totality. I'm thinking of head and forgot the toes. So we don't even have the awareness of our own body. So in contrast to a yogi having the awareness of the totality. So fundamentally, it boils down to swatantra, and that freedom, and that freedom retaining the capacity of pratibha, a sense of creativity that is intrinsic to being itself. So the Bernard mentioned of instinct, and then also almost we talked about the plants, and I agree there, because I don't believe that there is like Shiva has planned, he has like a little blueprint. Let me check here, and okay, this particular beam was supposed to be there, because that just means that he was free at one time to create the plan, and then after he's following the plan, he's just a slave of his own design. Because if you say there's a perfect design and he's the designer, then he designed one time and then that's it, he lost his freedom, because now he has to work exactly following the design. Then what about every instant retaining the same freedom? So that very idea of swatantra, not determined in the past. I was free yesterday, and then I am not free anymore. Like, I am free to choose to go where I go, and then, I start driving, and then if I keep randomly driving everywhere, then I would say, oh, I'm not free anymore. So, but this is why this creation is so beautiful. Is because it's not like I decided to drive to Pennsylvania and then I don't have any freedom now to choose to go to Vancouver, because then it's predetermined. I'm only following the road, I'm only following the map, I'm only following the Google. No, every instant has that absolute freedom within it, and that is why the game is so enjoyable.
So fun understanding both your perspectives. For the Kashmir Shaiva perspective, is that you could imagine that there's just a light, and how is it going to become aware of itself? It has this fundamental property. And so one of the ways that it becomes aware of itself is through expressing its creativity. And that's its freedom, is that it can manifest within itself because it has this self-awareness. And this freedom then is something that travels, including the freedom to become a constricted, seemingly limited being like us. And so what I'm understanding from you, from the Kashmir Shaiva view, is this freedom characterizes before any sort of emanation, that there is this self-awareness. And then the self-awareness is part of its own nature, likes to manifest out. And then this manifestation never really loses that freedom. It just gets scaled down until we're in our particular little bodies. But then, and this would be kind of analogous to what Bernard was talking about in terms of dissociation. But then by recognizing that freedom, we also have the ability to return back and to experience that Shiva hood that is the totality. Is that accurate as a summary?
Almost. Let me just summarize the metaphysics once more, because स्वभाव मबभावस्य विमर्शम विदुरन्यथा प्रकाशोऽर्थोपरक्तोऽपि स्फटिकादिजडोपमा स्वभावम अभावस्य विमर्शम विदु. I mentioned Swabhava. What is Swabhava? What is the intrinsic nature? It is the intrinsic nature of consciousness. What is the intrinsic nature of consciousness? It is reflexivity, Vimarsha. And if there were no Vimarsha, then Annatha Sphatika Dijadopama, it would be like a crystal, just reflecting things and not being aware of itself. So what lie within that intrinsic reflexivity is the fivefold expressions of being, the being as such, Chit, that is a consciousness, and that has this experience, joy, or coming into manifoldness, Ananda, and volition, cognition, and kriya, dynamism. So we used a lot of words of before, after, so we need to know that before, after, these categories require the sense of temporality. And this, in this pure dynamism, time is not the way it is construed. There is no before, after. It's a singular spontaneity. And that spontaneity, when we think of spontaneity, we are thinking maybe pulsation in terms of tides coming, and there is a temporal sequence in the tides coming and going. But in freedom, the intrinsic freedom, there is no first and last. There is no sequentiality. We call that akrama. So because my freedom is intrinsic to me, not given sequentially. I'm always free to be me. I may not be free to do everything I like in the world, but my freedom to experience myself as me lies all the time, and this is non-sequential. And within that non-sequential being underlies even kriya, dynamism. So therefore, this absolute, what we are calling consciousness, is constantly dynamic. So there is no Shiva or Shakti. There is no matter or consciousness. It is one singular, I call that Chiti or consciousness, that is pulsating. That is what is giving us the sense of externality. Materiality is nothing but the sense of externality. So when we have things that we see outside, then there is a materiality because we can metrify it, we can measure it, we can determine it. The horizon of determination is what constitutes materiality. There is no real materiality. It's just situatedness. It's being situated in the form of the given, given to my consciousness, basically. I think we
Yeah.
have some agreement there. So
Yeah, so
this is
Bernardo,
where, yeah. This
please.
is where we have to do a maybe different type of metaphysics to come to that conclusion. Thank you.
Yeah, so Bernardo, I'm kind of curious to hear your response because it seems to me at least like the Kashmir Shaiva view is willing to posit a lot more of these fundamental powers. So there is a will. This will is itself a form of action. So there is all this um, in the fundamental nature of consciousness that there is this sort of self-awareness, and the self-awareness is not determined. So it's not will as determination or will as, planning everything out, but just in its own self-awareness is this form of will to know. And there is this idea of chamatkara, of relish, of like that is itself an enjoyable state. So all that is there, all this sort of dynamism is there as fundamental of the nature of consciousness, even admitting the temporal language, before we get to this manifestation. So I'm curious if you can kind of compare and contrast where you see similarities to your view of the fundamental nature of consciousness and what you just heard from the Kashmir Shaiva perspective.
So maybe let me just start by trying to address a terminology misunderstanding that cost me and Rupert Spira a couple of years to sort of get through. So we avoid carrying that on in the conversation. Look, under most forms of idealism, there is only one ontological primitive. There is only one thing that exists truly, irreducibly, and that is one field of subjectivity. The variety of mental states that constitute our inner life and the world are local patterns of excitation of that one field of subjectivity, like different waves in the one ocean. There is nothing to the wave but the ocean that gives rise to it. There is only the ocean. So there is only the field of subjectivity, and particular experiential states like the feeling of hunger or the redness of a strawberry are local patterns of excitation, waves of this field of subjectivity. Now, if the only thing that exists is the field of subjectivity, then you are it, and I am it. Everything is it. Therefore, to be aware can only be to be aware of self. Insofar as you are that field of subjectivity, you can only be aware of yourself, because there is nothing but the field of subjectivity. All you can be aware of are the excitations of the field of subjectivity, which is what you are. Therefore, awareness, in this sense, implies self-awareness, because there is nothing beyond the self, the field of subjectivity, to be aware of. So Rupert says, to be aware is to be aware of the self, because there is nothing but the true self, the only irreducible self that exists, the dreamer behind the dream avatar. But this is not the sense in which I use the terms self-awareness. I use it almost exclusively, if I'm using it without disclaimers, I use it exclusively in the sense of cognitive psychology. Their self-awareness implies the creation of a second mental state that represents the original experience. For instance, sometimes you can be hungry, but you do not know that you are hungry. You notice it later. Now, to know that you are hungry is an extra experiential state next to the feeling of hunger itself. It's the knowledge of the feeling of hunger. That knowledge is itself an experiential state. In cognitive psychology, this is called a representational state. It's an experiential state that points to another experiential state, which it therefore represents. Now, for there to be this re-representation, this creation of a second experiential state that refers to the first, that's a higher level mental function. And that's what in cognitive psychology is called self-awareness or self-reflection or meta-consciousness or meta-awareness. There are several names for it. So when I
Just
say
to do a very quick pause, Acharyaji, you would agree that when he's talking about this metacognitive stuff, like I'm trying to remember and then I know I'm representing that, oh, my memory's at the tip of my tongue. This is not what we mean by Vimarsha, correct?
No.
Okay, so continue on. So what would be the other form of self-awareness? If we agree that this isn't the fundamental, we're not saying that the fundamental consciousness has this sort of, oh, I think I'm going to be hungry. Like there's no self-awareness in that way. Is there another form of self-awareness that you would admit into that fundamental level?
It's the first one I described, which is under idealism, if there is only one ontological primitive and it is a field of subjectivity and all there is it, then all awareness is the awareness of the self. So this is a sort of this is not a technical meaning of the expression self-awareness. It's constructed out of language because it's inevitable under an idealist framework.
Yes, that makes sense. So Acharyaji, Rupert is like a neo-Advaita teacher, and so maybe it would be helpful comparing the difference between the Advaita view, which is just Prakasha, and the Shaiva view, which is the union of Prakasha and Vimarsha. Maybe that'll help us get a little further. So can you explain why you would reject the Advaita view of there's just this light of awareness and everything's that, therefore awareness of anything is awareness of the self? Is Vimarsha something beyond that? What is the value of Vimarsha?
There's one thing we missed in this conversation is because when we jump into consciousness or universal consciousness and then compare it with universal meditation, we need to be mindful of the way we are using the vocabulary, because particularly for the Trika Saiva as well as for Advaita Vedantins, subjectivities are subordinate and subsumed within the chiti or chit, the singularity of consciousness. And in here, what they mean by chit, chaitanya, chiti, whatever the vocabulary they are using, this is not in contrast to materiality, or this is not in contrast to the body, because there is no mind-body type situation here, because these both are subsumed within Chitti or Chaitanya. So that is one thing. And how does subjectivity arise? Subjectivity is not fundamentally given here. In the field of experience, there is, I don't need to be constantly aware of me as the subject. There is and now I'm going to Trika Shaiva view, there is this the collective aham, and we should not say this as the singular subjectivity. That it is very appealing, but it is not the case, because within this aham lies the totality of consciousness and materiality. There lies the totality of being, consciousness, world, every single thing that is out there. And so from within this aham, there is now as if a separation. The one pole, the subject, and the other pole, the object. For me, any instant of I want to drink water, this there is not always I am, or whatever. There's always relational, so relational in the sense that my awareness of my embodied subjectivity is in relation to something in the horizon. There is this objective world, the field of consciousness that I'm relating myself, positing myself in contrast to or against. So there is me, and there is this field of experience, and that is when me becomes the subject. I pull myself to the center. If we have a circle and like a center and the periphery is the field of experience. The center, the focal point is my subject, my self-awareness. So the self-awareness as the center determined by periphery is determined by self-awareness at the center. These are relative terms, relational terms. And in that sense, for Abhinavagupta, myself, and we both would not have any problem with Dharmakirti. So he's one of the Buddhist philosophers, actually. So in this regard, we do not stick to Advaita Vedanta either, because for them, the subject is more like illusion and all those things. So that's not where we are in agreement with.
And so how does the necessity of Vimarsha, in addition to Prakasha, play into this important distinction?
So the big problem of Advaita Vedanta model of luminosity is who determines this luminosity. Luminosity is self-determined. Then that very mode of self-determination is what we are calling Vimarsha. They shouldn't be too scared of the vocabulary. It's a mode of self-determination, and if there is no self, there is no determination, and then because determining would require concepts and all those things, and they're very scared of, and then that is where the problems come. So the self-awareness is needed to conform my consciousness also. Like it's let's go to you know, you like more the cognitive research, then I can give you one example of anesthesia. Like some recent research I was reading that how patients even in anesthesia are able to have some type of comprehension of language. They are able to differentiate between nouns and verbs and even have some type of arrangement even while being fully in anesthesia. So it's not that they are fully unconscious, but we can't say the subjects in anesthesia are very much conscious. So the consciousness is layered, and that is why we are so comfortable to say that whatever we are calling matter is also just a mode of consciousness. And it's just a matter of how much we determine what is lacking there. Reflexivity. Therefore, in anesthesia, the subject is not reflexively aware of what it is cognizing, even though we now have cognitive tools like scientific tools to observe what is happening in the brain. So we will know more of the necessity of reflexivity, or to what extent this luminosity and reflexivity can be separated. But in the passive mode, I worked a lot. First, I started my PhD dissertation on Drishti Shrishti Advaita Vedanta. I continued working. I still work on Advaita Vedanta, but the fundamental problem I find is that this passive being situatedness of the Brahman to me seems like helpless. You know, just it's as well as just being a matter. You know, I mean inertia. If what is the point of having consciousness bereft of freedom? And so I would rather not be conscious than just to be conscious and not have freedom. It's like I would assume like being in a jail, or completely what is that, you know, metamorphosis of Kafka. You know, I have some consciousness, but I don't have the freedom to change my situatedness. So I wouldn't want to be this Kafkan cockroach, you know, or whatever that being is.
So, Bernardo, you're hearing a lot from the Kashmir Shaiva view, and you've talked now about a consciousness that can excite itself. It's not like it's a lake that has some external wind that comes to create the whirlpools. It can whirl itself. And so, would you be comfortable attributing some sort of powers, potentiality to consciousness that the will it has is not predetermined, it's spontaneous, and the spontaneity manifests itself in these excitations, and then what we're experiencing is as sort of these whirls that exist as part of the water, and then that's sort of a similar sort of model in the sense is that you're willing to go beyond maybe what Advaita Vedanta would do, and you're willing to say that actually there is a capacity for self-excitation within this fundamental consciousness. Is that fair to say? Or are you attributing the excitations mysteriously, hey, we don't know where they come from, Anirvachaniya, we just can't explain them, it just happens?
That would be very, very bad philosophy, right? I don't think even a new student at a bachelor's degree would get away with this. So no, I think to be is to have properties. So if the only thing that exists is this field of core subjectivity, by the way, when I use the word subjectivity, I don't mean personal or individual subjectivity. I think these are cognitive illusions. I don't think there is such a thing as individual subjectivity. But core subjectivity, obviously, there must be because it's implied by experience. Subjectivity is the experiencer behind the experience. Whatever the experiencer is, I'm not saying that it should be in a bag of skin or individuated or separate from the world, but there has to be that to which experience is given. It's entailed by the existence of experience. And it's in that sense that I say a field of subjectivity, a field of that to which experiences are given or disclosed, the dative of experience, to use a technical word. So if all there is this field of core subjectivity, then whatever dynamisms there are in nature, whatever changes of state, events, things that happen in nature, whatever there are, are by virtue of the intrinsic causal powers of this field of subjectivity. It cannot be otherwise. Otherwise, it's Deus ex machina, or there is an essential part of your metaphysics that you're not making explicit. So how would I use the word freedom in that sense? I think nature is absolutely free to be what it is. But does that mean libertarian free will? Does that mean that things could have been different in the past? I don't think that. I don't think things could have been different. I think nature does what it does because it is what it is. And it can't be other than what it is. And therefore, it can't do other than what it has done. So nature is making choices all the time. It is free to be what it is, and therefore it's free to do as it will do. But because it does what it does as a consequence of what it is, it couldn't have done otherwise once the act has been carried out, if you know what I mean. Libertarian free will, I think, and now I will speak technically. So this is not an attack on any stream of thought. I'm just trying to make the meaning of the terms I'm using explicit and precise. If I define libertarian free will as a middle ground, somewhere, a semantic in between randomness and determination, because when we talk about free will, we tend to intuit something that isn't random, but also isn't determined, right? Because if it is determined, it's not free. And if it's random, it's not will. So free will has to be in between. My contention is that there is no semantic space in between. It's incoherent to try to be in between. When we say free will, what we mean is we make choices based on our preferences, our tastes, our dispositions, our fears, our will. In other words, they are not random, they are determined. They are determined by our tastes, our preferences, our dispositions, or to make it even more summary, they are determined by what we are. We choose as we choose because we are what we are. And I think we can apply that to the whole of nature. Nature does what it does because it is what it is. So yes, in a sense, it's free to do whatever it will do because what it will do is a function of what it is. But once you know what has been done, I don't think there is any sense in contemplating a counterfactual. In other words, in asking yourself whether it could have chosen differently. It couldn't, because its choices are a function of what it is. And what it is what it is. Nature is what it is. We are what we are. So we do and choose as we do. Now, the reason I think this is still hopeful, the reason I think this isn't a prison, to go back to Sthaneshwar metaphor, is that I think, and I will use the technical term and then I will explain. I think nature is computationally reducible. In other words, nothing in nature can know in advance what nature will do next in all its fine details. We can predict roughly what will happen next in the short-term future, and that's what science is all about, predicting roughly what will happen next. But we are orders and orders and orders of magnitude away from predicting the next state of the universe in its full completeness. It is impossible. To predict that would require a computer bigger than the universe. So there is no shortcut. And what that means is that nature will only find out what it will do next once it does it. The only way to know what will happen next is to let the thing unfold. Nothing in nature can know in advance what will happen next. And therefore, to me, what is delightful about the experience of life is the discovery of what will happen next, because that tells us what we are and what nature is. We are the entities that make these choices. Nature is the thing that unfolds in this way. So the journey of life to me is a journey of discovery. It's a journey of self-discovery, because there is nothing but the self. And I think that is the play, that is the game. Nature has no other way to know itself but to allow itself to play out, to unfold and bear witness to itself. Because what it does, in other words, what unfolds, the events that unfold, are directly a function of what nature is. So by observing what unfolds, nature is learning what it is. That is the great magic. That to me, that's where the meaning comes from.
I wonder, Acharya, if you have a response to this. Otherwise, there's more we can ask about.
I would agree to many of the premises here. Fundamentally, but I just have a little note on freedom, because I'm translating freedom into Sanskrit as swatantrya, and how Abhinavagupta understands swatantrya. Swatantrya Shakti. Swatantrya is the intrinsic power of being, and because there is no separation between power and being, so it's just a mode or modification of being itself, and what happens within that is chromosim samsisriksha. Within that spontaneity arises the urge to constitute successiveness, sequentiality. Swatantra Shakti, Krama Samsisriksha, Kramatmata, and then attaining successiveness, order. This orderness, like everything one after another, how things come into being, we think that that is trapped, that's determined, and that is contradictory to freedom, and that's exactly the opposite of what Abhinavagupta is saying. Is it is the freedom that has created the order in the very first place for it to manifest. Otherwise, what it is like in before this creation or manifestation, Sarvam Sarvatmakam. Everything is everything else. Every single entity has the potential to transform or manifest into everything else. But why does it not do so? Because there is the order. And what constitutes the order? Kala Shakti. So this is the power of temporality. That is, what does it do? It is niti. It refrains from random manifestations. So you are never going to have rose hips, blooming into dahlia. So there is this order. And that creating order is the way freedom allows the manifestation of being into the way it has manifested. And so the way we have imagined freedom is not the way the Trika Shaivas have understood freedom. Thank you.
Would you tend to agree with that, Bernardo, not pitting freedom against order, but order is the expression of freedom?
Yes, I feel comfortable with that. Yes.
Okay, great. So the next thing I want to ask is, like, we've talked a lot about how this world kind of comes to be, but now let's talk a little bit about how the world shows up and how we experience them. In a lot of these idealist schools, there's this notion of our experiences having somewhat the nature of an illusion. Bernardo, I think in your past work, you've positively cited Donald Hoffman, who's given this argument that the world that we experience is basically like a user interface, that we didn't evolve for accurate vertical perceptions, we evolve for ones that are useful. And in my conversation with Amir, he mentioned that you're also a fan of, I mean, who isn't a fan of this, the allegory of the cave, right? So the idea that we're experiencing some sort of shadows, and it's not saying that they're illusory, they're just sort of like dimensionally reduced. So it's telling us something, whatever we're experiencing is telling us something about reality, but just not the full picture. So I wonder if you could say a little bit more about how you understand, as us embodied beings, the world that we experience. To what degree is it illusory? To what degree is it real? To what degree is it just some sort of reduced, giving hints of the real? So yeah, to what extent do us on an everyday basis encounter the real?
Yeah. Okay. The word illusion is a tough one to use clearly. It seems as though the sun orbits the earth. But that's not the case. We know that the earth orbits the sun. And yet when the earth orbits the sun, the way it appears to us and it should appear. The only way it can appear to us when the Earth orbits the sun is the sun going over the sky from day to night. So the idea that the sun orbits the Earth is an illusion, but there isn't anybody out there deceiving us. The sun is not out to deceive us. We deceive ourselves when we misinterpret appearances, right? That's what an illusion is. It's a misinterpretation of the real. That's what I'm driving to. So, and I'm driving to this statement: an illusion is a misinterpretation of the real, because I want to counter this false dichotomy between illusion and reality, because it leads to the idea that if it's real, it's not an illusion. If it's an illusion, it's not real. And what I'm trying to say is an illusion is a misinterpretation of the real. It's not a dichotomy. It's not an opposition. In this sense, I think the whole world we perceive around us and we take it to be as it appears is an illusion. I don't think the real world out there looks at all like matter in 3D space and single dimensional time. I don't think it has concreteness. I don't think it has colors. I don't think it has melodies. I don't think it has extension. It doesn't have space, doesn't have time. I think it's a semantic web. It's a web of semantic associations, experiential meaning associations. Now, why do I say that? Because there are so many different lines of argument in science and philosophy that render the likelihood of our seeing the world as it actually is to be very close to nil. So completely different lines of arguments that dovetail towards the same conclusion that I think it's now inevitable for us to have to acknowledge that the so-called physical world as it appears on the screen of perception is like a dashboard indication, a representation of the sky in an airplane's dashboard. The dashboard conveys important information about reality, about the sky. If a airplane pilot ignores the dashboard, the plane will crash and then everybody will die. So you have to take the dashboard seriously because it is useful and it does convey accurate information about reality. But it doesn't look like reality. The dashboard doesn't look like clouds and a horizon and the stars in the sky. It looks totally different, but it represents the reality outside the airplane. I think the screen of perception, everything we see, hear, touch, taste, and smell, is a dashboard. It conveys important information about the real world out there. It is also real as a dashboard. A dashboard is real. It exists. Our dashboard is real. It exists. This experience exists. This seeming physicality exists. But it isn't what we take it to be. We misinterpret that reality. We think what appears in the dashboard is the world as it is in itself. And that's almost absolutely certainly not the case. It cannot be the case. There are anthropic arguments for it. There are neuroscientific arguments for it. There are game theory arguments for it. And they all converge to the same inevitable conclusion. The world we think is out there is our inner cognitive representation of what is really out there. And what is really out there stands to be as different from this physical world we perceive as the sky is different from an airplane's dashboard.
So to take your analogy of the sun moving around and how we perceive it, we are perceiving something that's actually happening. The problem is that we impose these concepts on it, and then these concepts lead to a misinterpretation. So would the idea be that we can remove our conceptualization, which prevents us from perceiving things correctly, or that there really is nothing besides conceptualization? Because we can learn to look at the sun, well, not directly if we're trying to keep our eyes set, but we can learn to look at the sunset without any sort of conceptual imposition. And then what we're seeing is we're just seeing a perceptual fact, right? Is that your model? that, hey, maybe if we somehow were able to get rid of all these misconceptions, we could perceive what is there? Or are you saying that really like it's like there's a dashboard, but there is nothing beyond that? All we ever have access to is the dashboard. So are concepts a filter or are concepts all we have?
I think there is a world, there is a real world out there, but I don't think it looks at all like what appears on the screen of perception. I don't think it can look at all like what appears on the screen of perception. And I think multiple lines of evidence and argument show very conclusively that it does not look at all like what appears on the screen of perception. But in the same way that a dashboard is modulated by the sky, look, what appears on the dashboard are sensor measurements. An airplane has sensors, airspeed sensor, ground speed sensor, air pressure sensor, wind direction sensor, now all kinds of sensors, radar sensors. And what appears on the dashboard are the measurements performed by these sensors. But the sensors are modulated by the real sky outside. So what appears on the dashboard is a function of the sky outside. It doesn't look like the sky outside, but it is modulated by it. And therein lies the evolutionary value of the screen of perception. If it weren't modulated at all by the real reality out there, it would have no value. You know, if you go after the tree with the nice fruit to eat, and then there's nothing there, you're gonna die. You're not gonna pass on your genes. So the genes that were passed were those of the living beings whose dashboard was finely tuned towards modulation by the real environment. It's just that the results of these measurements, this modulation, is presented to us in a form that is useful to our survival and not in a form that represents the appearances of the world accurately. There is no survival advantage in seeing the world as it is. The survival advantage is seeing the world in a manner that allows us to react and respond promptly to environmental challenges and opportunities. That's what it's all about. So I think there is a reality. That reality is mental. It is really out there. We do share a real world. It's a mental world. But what we see on the screen of perception is a representation modulated by the real world. It's not the real world as it is in and of itself.
That's really helpful. And I think it's kind of interesting. So Acharji, the Kashmir Shaiva view is not as adamant that our experience of reality is really conceptually mediated by some sort of interface. It generally puts actually a lot of emphasis on how we can perceive the world and engage with the world without these filters of concepts, without the vikalpas, as we would say them. And it also seems to suggest that, we wouldn't want to say that the world is illusory, but we would want to say that our perception of the world is incomplete. This idea of apurnata khyati, that we just see a little bit, but the goal is basically that we can recover the full picture. So maybe right now we're just tuned into a little snippet of it, and then that's the cause of so many of our maladaptive behaviors. But if we could restore that bigger picture, the full perspective, then we live a more adaptive, maybe not evolutionarily adaptive alone, but certainly in terms of well-being, wellness, art, sentiment, all the things that seem to matter to us as humans, we live a much fuller life. So can you respond to what Bernardo said and talk a little bit about the Shaiva theory of perception and concepts and whether our perception is necessarily conceptually mediated?
So I'm starting from this little Bernardo's candy, whether I should eat or not. Meaning, one smart scientist gives me one candy, and instead of having something actually sweet, it just has some chemicals that just gives me the excitement. Some taste bud excitement that mimics the state of something being tasty. So at the end of the day, if we think that the excitement of taste bud is the same as actual tasting, then I'm doomed. So far, my whole life, whatever limited fun I'm having, limited joy I can have in touching, tasting, listening to music, and every single thing. I would like, no matter how small the portion I'm having a real tiny piece of cake. And now when someone says, it's an illusory piece of cake, you can feel it like that, no problem, then the world becomes a very different place to me. I'm okay to have a tiny piece, but I want to have the real piece, not the illusory piece. So now coming to Shaiva metaphysics, based on this, is what is their basic epistemology? In perception, the reality is self-revealing. I would not even say the subject sees the truth. It's reality recognizing itself. Every event of perception is reality recognizing itself. What is reality? Being, consciousness, bliss. Sat Chit Ananda. There is no problem even with the Trika Shaiva. They go a little more fancy, and Chit Ananda, Icha Jnana Kriya, like a fivefoldness rather than threefoldness. Essentially, let's stick to what most of us have heard. There is tiny bit of joy, there is tiny bit of self-awareness, there is every mode affirming its being. And what is added to this? In every mode of perception, every event of cognition is naming, determination, rupa, ascertaining. Rupa, rupana is not just form, color. It's a mode of ascertaining, like a determination. So what we do is we have some type of conceptualization and the mode of determining a process. And so those two things are contingent upon the body, the culture, and all the evolutionary processes that have taught us how to determine certain things, like how to interpret a red rose as a red rose, or a snake as a snake, or a tiger as a tiger. And so all these things will come to play there, but you can take out that tigerness of a tiger, and all is left is this being, consciousness and bliss. Those things are irreducible. Within that, there is not even a subject and object. There is just a singular field. So every event of consciousness is a reaffirmation of the absolute in the absolute sense. So sanmatra avagahi pratyaksham. So the mode of perception is self-ascertaining, confirming its own being. And every event, therefore, is also the event of pratyavamarsa, or recognition of the self. I am recognizing myself in every mode of consciousness, but it does not appear like that. I'm always, this is like a determining something out there. So within that, we could almost again trace this Merleau-Pontian horizon. We have the horizon, and then something as a picture. There is the house, like you take a snapshot of a house, and then there is a mountain in the background. So the same way, in every event of consciousness, there is the subject at the core, and there is the object, the field, the background, horizon. And so that is how our conceptualization comes into being. That's how our imagination comes into being. But even in imagining, even in fantasizing, why should I have to? No, I'm scared of the words like a phantasmagoria or illusion or something like that, because even in fantasy there is something real. So they excite me. They give me why should I accept excitement as real? Is now we go back to the metaphysics of reality. What do you mean by reality? Something, anything that has some kind of causal efficiency. So something that can have a real effect. Dharmakirti, I'm following Dharmakirti here. So, but some other acharyas do agree to that. So there is this causal efficiency of dreams, of fantasies also. Not as much as this water, I can quench my thirst, but sometimes if we have nothing, even imaginary water does help feel in alter our mental state. And that alteration of mental state is also real. So it's not just some physical thing has to be real. And if we go back to mental causation and things like that, then we will open up a broader picture of how that has certain even more higher degree of validity. So apurnata khati, the vocabulary might sound new to some, is a sort of manifestation of something not in its totality. And that is why there is no event of consciousness that completely satisfies us. We like it, and there is something left behind. Every mode of consciousness is orgasmic in nature because there has to be joy. It's fun, but it's not complete. I want a little bit more. That is why we have this wanting towards more experience, more joy, more excitement, if I follow his vocabulary. But at the end of the day, why it is happening is the totality is not revealed. We have not situated ourselves in that absolute sense. And as long as there is this splitted situatedness of the subject and object, a separated horizon, there never is the sense of the totality experiencing itself. And so I'm experiencing something out there. And then there is this finiteness, limitedness. But I would refrain from representations and shadows, because we are creating a chasm between what is to be real, and we can't really go back to say the real is out there. Either real is immediately given or it doesn't exist. Because I don't want to go real is out there up in the heaven. That's another ghost we are trying to create. It doesn't. It's just the same thing. So therefore, if anything is real, it's immediately given. If it is not given, then why should that be? And that's where I would say like that. Then the real is only given through fantasies. That's a deal breaker to me. Why would I want to consider that as real if that is mediated through fantasies? So therefore, if something is real, it's got to be given to me, or it's not there. That's the way I would like to take on that.
So this is really interesting. If I'm hearing you right, Acharyaji, what you're saying is, okay, there's this, I have a subject, I have an object, I have some sort of mediation by cognition. There is this triad, that's fine. And this is kind of what the interface metaphor is talking about. But that itself is secondary. That's all emergent. What's actually fundamentally given is the totality itself, consciousness itself and its self-revealing nature. And it's only secondarily that it gets broken up into this thing out there, this thing in here, the mediation. So whatever that conceptualized mode is secondary to the primary mode, which is the self-revealing nature of this in and of itself. Is that a fair summary?
That's exactly what I'm trying to suggest.
Okay. Bernardo, I'm wondering how that resonates with you, because he's not fundamentally denying the metaphor. He's just saying, and this is maybe one of the distinctions, and we'll get to this towards the end, of what you're doing with analytic idealism and what maybe Kashmir Shaivas are doing, is that in Kashmir Shaivism, there's a huge emphasis on practice. How do we realize this truth, right? And so for us, it's like, yes, there's a form of descriptive phenomenology, is how do things show up to us? And yes, they do show up with some sort of conceptual mediation. We make representations, so on and so forth. But then there's also a prescriptive element of how can this show up? And so I wonder if granting your metaphor holds for a descriptive thing of most of us on our day-to-day basis, if you're willing to grant or show interest in the idea that maybe what's most fundamentally self-revealing is in each moment, so not just going back to prior to the Big Bang, but in each moment, that the most fundamental thing that's most given to us is the experience of consciousness itself as a totality prior to this emergence of this triadic structure.
I'm not only comfortable with that, I think it's true. Most debates are about terminology, right? So allow me to insist on that a little bit. When I say an external world, I'm taking the perspective of a dissociated complex in the mind of nature, which is what I seem to be right now. If you stick a needle in my arm, I feel it. If you stick a needle in my armchair, I don't feel it. So there seems to be a boundary between the experience I call life on the inside and the world out there. And I think that's an illusion in the sense that it's a misinterpretation of what's happening. I don't think there is a personal self or a personal subject. I think there is only this extended field of core subjectivity, but it undergoes a well-known process called dissociation, and it renders my inner life cognitively dissociated from the mental states beyond my dissociative boundary. So I don't feel the needle when it hits my armchair. I only feel when it hits my arm. This is not the essence of what I am. It's an appearance, but as an appearance, it's real. I really do not feel that needle when it's inserted in my armchair. And I really feel it when it's inserted in my arm, right? So taking this reducible, non-fundamental perspective, there is a world beyond me, because I don't feel that needle when it hits my armchair. To me, this is an empirical given. And it's also, I consider it very, very difficult, if at all possible, to do away with the notion of an external world. External in the sense I just referred, mental states beyond the boundaries of the alters, the dissociated complexes that we call life. Because if you were to be in my study with me right now, you would describe my study in a way that is entirely consistent with how I describe it. And even though in both cases, they would be dashboard representations, not the thing in itself, both representations are modulated by an external reality. And if that hypothesis is correct, then the dashboards would remain consistent with one another, even though neither is ultimately real. But there is something real beyond them, the external world, external from the perspective of this dissociated process, that impinges on the different dashboards in a way that renders them consistent with one another. If there were multiple planes flying in the same sky, their dashboards would agree. They would be mutually consistent with one another, even though no dashboard is the sky. The consistency can be explained by the fact that there is an actual sky, which is not the dashboard and which modulates all the dashboards. So from this perspective, I think analytically speaking, and analytically speaking means surrendering to logic and surrendering to extension, 3D space-time, because both are built into our language. I can't speak unless I concede those two illusions. I know they're illusions. Logic is an illusion, extension is an illusion, but if I am to open my mouth and speak, I'm structurally forced to sort of presuppose that illusion. Otherwise, I can't open my mouth and speak. So making that concession, I think it is inevitable to speak of an external world, external in the sense beyond my individual mind, not outside mind. There is nothing outside mind. There is nothing outside consciousness. But the hypothesis of mental states, excitations of a field of subjectivity beyond the boundaries of this individual entity and your individual entity, I think explanatorily speaking, it's an inevitable hypothesis that we have put forward. And it's also an incredibly powerful hypothesis in terms of its usefulness. It's very useful if I want to meet you and speak to you and shake hands with you, that we say, let's meet tomorrow at the railway station. It's very useful to think of an external railway station that is there beyond your inner life and my inner life, so we can come together. Or the restaurant where we need to go to have a meal and continue to survive. So with all these disclaimers and caution alerts, I think it is inevitable to speak of an external world, but that external world is only outside my current state of mind, my dissociated state of mind. The external world is not outside what I actually am, which is the one field of subjectivity that you are too, and that everybody is. So from this more ultimate and less operational, less useful perspective, but deeper and philosophically truer, there is no external world in the sense of outside what I really am. All there is what I am, which happens to be what you are and what everything is. So it's important when we speak, I think, that we sort of make explicit at what level in the conceptual hierarchy we are speaking from. There is something useful to be said from the platform of every level. If we only speak from the point of view of the absolute, there would be no politics, no engineering. Society as we know would not exist, because we can't say a great many useful things using language and presupposing extension and presupposing logic that need to be said if we are to coordinate our collective efforts in the form of a civilization. On the other hand, the things that really matter to the meaning and sense of life, and perhaps to personal fulfillment, cannot be uttered from the platform of convenience and useful applicability or language and logic. They have to be experienced directly by direct acquaintance and not through the mediation of language and analytic philosophy. The reason I consistently speak from one of the penultimate platforms and not from the ultimate is very simple, and I have complete peace about it. I'm not an enlightened being. I'm not spiritually skilled. I'm an analytic philosopher. And I am, and I know how limited this perspective is, how not transformational it is. I hope it's useful in some other way to give people the freedom to give themselves intellectual license to explore the deeper perspectives. That's why I do what I do. But yeah, I'll stop here. I spoke too much.
No, it's really, and one of the things I've loved about learning about your work is how you will spontaneously kind of come up with ideas that find really great parallel. So we have this term vyavahara, like we have to speak about the world of transactions. That's literally what it means. And one of the major problems that we critique with some people who get too into this non-duality stuff is that they only try to talk about the ultimate. And it's so ineffective. I'm hungry. Who is the I that is hungry? Like they do this for hours. So it's like, us Shaivas, we don't mess with that. But Acharya, I'm kind of curious to get your response about this. Is that, of course, there is a recognition of the requirement to speak about the world, right? And we need to be able to talk about, hey, I'm going to meet you on Zoom, and these sorts of things. Not Shiva's going to Shiva with Shiva on Shiva, right? We need to be able to talk about these sorts of things. But I'm curious if you could talk a little bit more about when you talk about the givenness and you talk about sort of experience outside of this triadic bifurcated structure, what is it precisely that is given to us before there's a separation into what you might call the dashboard or interface view? What is this fundamental givenness that's there each and every moment? Dharmakirti has Swasam Vedana. What is our understanding of this thing that's given in each and every moment prior to all this bifurcation?
As we went back to Swabhava, what is this Swabhava? This is the wonder, Chamatkara. This is the joy of being. And I would not separate the joy of being from being here, having this conversation with you, because I didn't create that dichotomy. You imposed that. I never said this is some kind of finite subsequent to, this is not even parallel. This is what it is. This is Shiva experiencing this particular mode of being, having dialogue between us in two. We have assumed our separatedness and we have maintained this dialogue and we have enjoyed our company, and sometimes not so much, or whatever happens, fighting in huntreza hani yasech namo, like in the Rudram we get he is the hunter and he is the hunted, so finding oneself in all different situatedness, that's what multiplicity does. But coming back to doing philosophy from Trika perspective, because that's, I think, just like Bernard's statement, I would like to add that I do not think that philosophy does its job very well by just describing or categorizing or defining categories. At least we can do away from philosophy. Physics has done a lot better job in that regard, honestly speaking. And then now, when I read books on philosophies, they are like handmaiden of physics. They are just trying to appease to physicists rather than trying to enlighten them. Let's go back to the roots of. There is only one philosophy, So that's it. It's just not like this or that. All these categories, forget. So our urgency to recognize who we are, and that urgency to recognize who we are is also our recognition of being situated in whatever the situations in the world. So the way the Greeks understood, and that's exactly the way the philosophers in the East also understood. And I think we have taken it a little too far in this occupational, desktop philosophies. But I think that we can trace back and go to its roots, the actual purpose of philosophy, to give us freedom, to help us recognize who we are, what is our real nature, what we are destined to be in the world, not outside. Forget outside of the world. This is all we have, and the being in the world is. Being situated in the world is all we have, and all those mumbo jumbo, we can stop thinking about it. So this, I think, philosophy is helping us to recognize, and this is upaya in the sense the means, a medium, a mechanism, and considering it mechanism. Not also explained about the difference in vocabulary, and if I can go so far to beg him to maybe slightly change one word, no objection there, but it's just the idea. It to me seems almost like going back to the Buddha. I love Buddha, okay, I'm not, but the word dukkha doesn't make me feel really good about it. Let's move away from the vocabulary of explaining the world as a problem. Let's get away from the words that kind of remind us of some disease or anything, because the world is a beautiful place. It's limited, it's a very small piece of pie, and I hate it. I want to be the guy who gets the whole pie, but that's it. I'm not gonna get it. So therefore, let's stop being a baby and start complaining and throwing and beating the plate and everything. So this world is a beautiful place. And philosophy helps us recognize that even in this finite, limited time we have, we can love each other, we can have some songs together, share our stories together, love each other, and have our moments of joy, so and not consider that as some kind of excitement of neurons. So now this is joy. Some guy gave me a jab of neuron. I hate that. I don't like to think that my being happy in the world is some crazy guy, giving me a neurological jab. So this is really happening, and philosophy should help us see the world in its finitude as beautiful. And that is when it doesn't need to put you in meditation. What is meditation? Me having this thought is meditation. So this is not meditation. That's like going to sleep. So having pure thoughts, having a reflective consciousness. So I think whether or not you like to claim, I'm sure you are helping people to go deep, and I also believe that Trika system is also helping us be reflective about ourselves, our situatedness in all these limitedness, and how we have imposed our own boundaries. That's foremost thing for me, to recognize that whether I'm exceeding the boundary, to say that every single boundary is my own imposition, that's a different story. We can talk about that later. But there indeed are so many things we have imposed upon ourselves. At least this philosophy could help us recognize how many boundaries we have imposed upon ourselves, that help us, that stops us from recognizing love that permeates, that splashes out beyond me, actually, that kind of allows us to go beyond my physicality, and that envelops our being And so I think that philosophy can help, and philosophy is a method, and what we do matters because it's real, and our songs are real, our love is real, and our joy, our laughter is real, and that's all we have. It's limited, but it's real. Thank you.
So just to sum up, something that I heard was sort of this idea of, we don't want to treat the world as a problem. The Buddha said dukkha, it's suffering, suffering, suffering. And to some extent, if we focus too much on dissociation as the model, maybe it's porting over some sort of negative associations, or maybe it's the view of just us as bound beings. But if we kind of return back to this idea of, well, the fundamental consciousness has excitations, it has capacity, it has joy, and what you might call dissociation from one perspective is also the bubbling forth of freedom and joy and autonomy. And the boundaries that we have, they're not just dissociations, they're also things that we are actively imposing upon ourselves from moment to moment. And it allows us to experience the world from a particular vantage point. But there are also things that we can sort of remove and then experience this totality once again. And so if I see you, you're just not quibbling with the mechanics, but just a way of framing it that would bring this sort of joy and bliss back into our lives. And that leads me to something that I wanted to ask you about, which is, and Bernardo, despite what you say, like, hey, I just hope this helps a lot. There's this whole tradition of the unexamined life isn't worth living. It's so obvious to tell from the way that you talk about this that you care very deeply. And the way that there's so many people on this call, it shows that this matters. There is, we're not just sitting on our armchairs. This sort of mode of thinking is doing something beneficial, of value, of intrinsic worth. And so I think that's a lot of what I'm seeing here. Now, from the Shaiva perspective, obviously, liberation, it's soteriological, right? So it's willing to go further into this territory that maybe we wouldn't if we're just thinking in terms of the classical definition of Western philosophy. So Acharyaji, I wanted to get your sense of what that looks like. So in Shaivism, at least from what I've understood, there kind of are some of these theories of how these people who have this recognition of like, hey, we are all part of this, like fundamentally what I am is this one consciousness, that there are at least two theories of how this world shows up to such people. One is this theory of aesthetics. I've heard of this thing called Shanta Rasa, that like the world appears as something to savor, and this seemed to be what you were talking about, is like, yeah, there are bad moments, but even these bad moments, there's some sort of blissfulness in them. And then the other thing would be like, you talked about meditation, and it's not just being a rock saying Om, but there is this concept that you've mentioned of the Purna Ahanta, of this, the world is my body. And so I'm wondering if you could just tell us a little bit about, from your perspective, what philosophy can really do in terms of changing how we experience the world from the aesthetic perspective of how we engage with the world, but then also from this, really liberatory perspective of how the world shows up according to Pratyabhijna. Because one thing I did want to mention that's really interesting is that Bernardo, this thing of like, well, we're these dissociated alters of the original. Pratyabhijna, the name of the Shaiva philosophy, is the recognition that I am this alter of the original. That's the name of the philosophy itself. That's the entire premise. We have these 5-stage proofs. And so what you're talking about from the Shaiva perspective is very liberatory. And so I'm wondering if Acharyaji, you could just kind of cue up what it looks like if one recognizes that, which we are currently intellectually understanding from Bernardo and some of the other leading analytic idealists.
Sarvo mamayam vibhava iti evam parijanata vishwatmanaha vikalpanam prasarepi maheshita. When you recognize that everything, all of you, all these manifestations is my own expression. So even when the world is appearing, I'm experiencing, I'm in the world, enjoying, and enjoying is not just enjoying, suffering, all that included within that. I am still not bereft of my absolute Shiva nature because it is never gone, it's never lost. So coming back to what is this liberate, the word liberation is very problematic, so I want to get away from that because there's nowhere to liberate from. This is the world to be in, to recognize, that's a good word. I want to recognize myself because sometimes I forget my powers and my being in the world. So this being in the world, if you recognize your being in the world the way the Trika Shaivas are teaching you, first of all, you are recognizing your perpetual wonder, because the chamatkara is every instant of being is wondrous being. And I don't feel that way because there is all these limitations. You know, sometimes, let's say I'm having a toothache, and I go back to my toothache and I stop laughing, you know, because my toothache kind of comes back. But when I forget about it, then I can have fun. I forget about the pain I'm undergoing and I can simply enjoy. So there is this background, you know, foundation of joy, of bliss as a constant given. And upon that, we have imposed all these conditions. So therefore, the moment of liberation is not in contrast of something supernatural outside out there. It is here, right now. It's happening. And why don't I see it? It's like you just wrap up your light with the tents of, you know, drapes, and then if there is light, why don't I see it? No, just remove those curtains, and it's always luminous there. That's one. But what about the modes of consciousness, like anger, like you know, horror, like what you say, all kinds of different emotions, heroic and tragic and all those. Why have these best of the best, you know, poets written tragedies? There is some sense of savoring there. There is some sense of joy you can experience even when you are watching tragedy. And there is nothing wrong about it. You are not like some sadistic, sick person. It's just a way of you elevating from basic raw emotions to transformed aesthetic bliss. Every coarse experience, every coarse emotion can be elevated to a higher aesthetic joy. So fury can be joyous when it is aesthetically presented. So your life can be aesthetically presented. And so every event, even disgust, I had a long paper on disgust just a month ago. Even disgust can be savored. There is one book actually, Savoring Disgust, by a contemporary philosopher. So, you know, like how can we enjoy even the most compromised things? That's what we do. That requires a transformed gaze, not the transformed situation. Like we have to change perspective, not the thing itself. So this is what Trika Shaiva can teach us in two ways. One is in recognition. We go and recognize our situatedness in this absolute all the time. And then when we are able to experience these determined modes of experience, and then when we have so many types of emotions, then we are transforming all these emotions into joyous moments of aesthetic bliss, savoring, rasa, chamatkara. So this is the wonder. That is Abhinavagupta. He didn't just give us metaphysics. You know, you have to read his Dhwani. He was one of the greatest aesthetes, by the way. So we should not separate. Most Indologists, you know, he gave two different philosophies on aesthetics and on metaphysics. But no, there is a reason why he was working on mundane experiences, because to separate them is fundamentally wrong. They are one and the same. This is all experiences we are having, and the anger, you know, transform that, and then it becomes a Raudra rasa. See? So all these different basic core emotions can be transformed and presented aesthetically. So people turn, you know, some of the disgusting things into delicious meal. You know, what is delicious is not like, okay, he just likes to eat disgusting food. That is wrong. It's wrong to say that way. So some people who don't like durian, they don't like it. I love it. I love bitter melon. I love spicy chilies, and that's what most people don't eat. So it's just our capacity to process them in a proper way. So therefore, the world is like sometimes spicy, like crazy Carolina Reaper, and you can still enjoy it if you have the taste buds refined that way. Sometimes the world is as bitter melon, but you can still enjoy it, if you have trained your taste buds to savor the bitterness. So it's the world is not the problem. Our ability to process it in a proper way is what is required. And I would say only, it's more like an absolutistic term, but only philosophy can do that, because I don't think that is the task the philosopher, the physicists can steal from us. When philosophy started, it was everything, and then they have stolen, physicists have stolen most of the things from us. That's okay, they're all children, but I don't think they can even steal this particular upaya, like as a philosophy, as a method, as a way of life, as a way of living, enjoying being in the world. And I don't think they will start and no, that's a part of physics. So I think that in that particular front we are safe and we have secured our job. Thank you.
So in our conversation, we started out with, what is the way that you refute materialism? That took us to this question of what is the nature of consciousness itself? How does that translate into our lived phenomenological experience? And what implications does that have pragmatically for how we should live and how we should experience? So I think we've gotten the most complete, authentic presentation of these two traditions from really beginning to end in a small nugget form. Bernardo, I wanted to start with you. Is that what are the differences that you perceive? Are there any sort of fundamental differences or any sort of fundamental areas of confusion you have um, between these sorts of two philosophies? Because the one thing that we don't want is just for everyone to agree and oh yeah, it's all the same. But it's we iron sharpens iron, right? So if we can find these distinctions, it actually helps everyone flesh out their own belief system. So I'm curious if there are any points where you see room for disagreement or ambiguity or different fundamental assumptions from the start to the finish.
It's difficult for me to say because I'm not a student, let alone an expert in Kashmiri Shaivism. So whatever I say, you have to take with a whole bag of salt, and perhaps you're safer ignoring it altogether and not taking it seriously at all. I picked up certain vibes in the discussion today. I can respond to those, but with the disclaimer that it's probably my own misinterpretation and straw man burning. So keep this in mind. I am not personally acquainted with this intrinsic joy of life that I understood underlies all experiences of life in the world. I'm not personally acquainted with it. Insofar as I can discern empirically, there is just as much suffering as there is joy out there. I don't think it would be useful for me to go to people in Ukraine now and say, well, you are suffering because you're hiding the light. In fact, there is joy underlying your life. I could be shooed away from the country because it could be construed as insulting. I remember I was a kid, I don't know, 5, 6 years old, and I observed with morally neutral but deep fascination a colony of ants dragging a live cricket to the ant colony. And in the process of doing that, cutting off pieces of the wings and the legs of the cricket, one small piece at a time. And I remember thinking, and it was always absolutely clear and without doubt to me that every living being is conscious. And I remember thinking, this cricket is suffering in a manner that I couldn't even begin to describe, and yet I had that morbid fascination of staying right there on all fours, observing that drama unfold. The carnage in our lawns that unfold every day is is unspeakable. There was in the beginning of the war a video made by Russian soldiers. They filmed themselves castrating a Ukrainian soldier, and I had the misfortune of watching that. That is part of the world. It's not an exception. Years ago, I watched a documentary, A Pride of Lions. They managed to bring down an adult elephant, fully grown elephant that had separated from its group. And the lions, once the elephant was down, it couldn't stand up again. And the lions started eating the elephant from the hind legs upwards. And a film crew documented the entire process. It took 6 hours of being eaten alive for the elephant to lose consciousness. That's nature. The lions were doing lion things. The elephant was doing elephant things. That said, and I want to complete this part of my answer on a reconciliatory note. Some people present today, they know that I suffer from a condition that in the Netherlands is a lawful reason to request euthanasia. It's not a condition that is fatal. It's not going to kill me, but it makes people not want to live. So 2 to 3 people on average in the Netherlands undergo assisted suicide by their GPs because of the same condition I have at exactly the same level I have. It's called catastrophic tinnitus. I almost committed suicide twice several years ago. Today, I am in an unimaginable level of peace with it, to the extent that I have refused taking part in a trial with the promise of alleviating or even solving the condition, because I thought it was worse to think about the thing 6 months long during the trial than to just move on with my life. So I'm not able to report that I found the underlying joy. I live my life more in the spirit of, in the sacrificial spirit, in the spirit of allowing nature to do through me whatever nature wants to be done. And from that, I derive the meaning of my existence. So in a sense, I derive the deepest satisfaction possible from living in this sacrificial way. I do what I feel I'm responsible for, what I feel I should do, the sense of, playing my part in the dance. So it's very fulfilling. I wouldn't describe it as joy, though. So I'm not acquainted with that underlying joy. I am acquainted with a endless dimension of meaning. And to me, that's enough. But my experience with tinnitus forces me to not be dismissive of the underlying joy that has been described. If I've gotten to a point, being the hard-headed person I am, of not even thinking about tinnitus during most of my days. At night, it's impossible not to think about it. But most of my days, I don't even think about it. To think that this is possible and to think about it, of this fact, as if I were back in 2019 when I almost killed myself twice, it would have been absolutely not only insulting, but absolutely unthinkable that I could have peace with this condition, that I could find a place where I'm okay with it. It's okay that life goes on like this for another 30 years, or even a little worse, not much worse, a little worse. I could tolerate that too. That was as unthinkable to me then as the notion of a deeper joy underlying all of nature is to me today. And because I know for a fact that I was wrong then, I will not dismiss the hypothesis of an underlying joy. But I think we have to be very careful about it, because I know half a world would feel insulted by this.
Thank you so much for sharing not just the ideas, but also why they're personal to you. It means a lot. Would there be any sort of other areas of disagreement that came to mind that you'd want to surface for us before I hand it over to Acharya for a response?
Oh, I would philosophically nitpick, which is not productive. Maybe I'll say this. I agree that most of modern analytic philosophy is a wasteful kind of mental masturbation. It's useless. It serves no purpose. It's meant to fulfill a quota of published papers. But I do think there is a role for philosophy, irrespective of the current status of analytic philosophy or academic philosophy. And the reason I think that is that we are all philosophers. The human animal is the philosopher animal. We all contemplate, we all think about life, we all search for meaning, we all have questions, who am I, where did I come from, what am I supposed to do, what is the meaning of it all? That's philosophy, that's lived daily philosophy. And because we are all doing that, and we are all over the map in the process of doing it, I think there is a role for a profession, even if that role is not being appropriately fulfilled today, there is a role for a profession that at least tries to help people to think more clearly. That reduces perhaps meta-suffering, not the intrinsic suffering associated with this condition we call life, but the suffering induced by the inability to accept natural suffering. Because when we reject natural suffering, then we meta-suffer. Then we suffer even more. And I think philosophy plays a role in reducing meta-suffering by helping us think more clearly, deceiving ourselves less, becoming more aware of moments where we are contradicting our own line of thinking. And to do that, I think it's important for philosophers to meet people where they are. And again, they are all over the place. So to bring people out of a hole, you have to first go into the hole. You have to assume the conceptual paraphernalia that people take for granted, even if it's absolutely wrong. You have to speak their language. Because only then, only if you're speaking their language and deploying their own conceptual dictionary, which is the only one they understand, can you meet them and extend a hand and pull them out. So what I'm trying to say is that sometimes I think it is legitimate to speak in error in order to pull somebody out of error along with you. Of course, there is some arrogance in saying this because it sort of presupposes that I am in a better place than people are, and goodness knows often I am in a very deep hole and I need someone to extend a hand to me. But then I wish that someone speaks my language and uses my conceptual dictionary, because otherwise I know that person can't help me. So yeah, it's not really, I'm not really making philosophical points here because I don't know enough of Kashmiri Shaivism to have a refined discussion in that sense. But I said what I intuited I wanted to say.
Yeah, it's beautiful. And I mean, Shaivism is all about dialogue. So the fact that we're even trying to muddle through these different systems, I think is, it's very clarifying. So, on our last thing today, Acharya, I'd like to give you a chance to kind of offer your sort of takeaway. And I think this is the craziest thing a moderator could do. Hey, our last question, solve the problem of evil for us. But I think obviously you've experienced a lot in your life of these difficulties, and there's a lot that Shaivism has to say about meeting people where they are, and then finding a way to kind of transform that experience into something. And it's also a tradition that doesn't say this is all illusory, so don't worry about it. It treats the world as real. And so I'm wondering if you could maybe offer some general thoughts if you have them, but then maybe this would be an earnest and like deep place to end, which is how do you experience and how do you talk about in that, like, if it's real, there is a lot of suffering, um, there is a lot of darkness. And so then what is the Shaiva approach to that? How do we understand this? How do we make sense of this? How does this become part of the practice? I think that would be a great way to end if you could give us some perspective on that.
Yeah, because there is a moment of sharing, and with all sincerity, I would like to share to conclude. In 1997, I was in my classroom teaching half a dozen students of mine, Kashmir Shaivism, of course, in Nepal, in Kathmandu. A group of Maoists attacked us through the windows. They hurled hundreds of bricks, and I was knocked unconscious. I still have deep scars on my head. I was taken to hospital. All the national newspapers those days covered, because I was one of the first professors to be attacked. And that led me to self-inquiry about myself, being in life-threatening situations multiple times, turns out. And what does that have given to me? Not anxiety, really. Not worried or not scared. A purpose of being, that being itself is so pristine, purposeful. And I also recognize the limitations, finitude of being in the world. And so when I say it's joyous, I do not mean, and I don't think these acharyas also meant that this is just ahaha. Like, that's why I had to give even etymological meaning in the beginning, that this Ananda is samriddhi. It's some type of satisfaction. It's some type of gratification of being. And what is that? Is a telos, a purpose. So there is a lower telos and there is a higher telos. My teacher, once, one of my Guruji, was hit by a bus. Not very bad accident, but he still lost two teeth, It just hit on the side, and he was just trying to catch the bus, got knocked off, and then lost two teeth. We took him to hospital. And next day, of course, we all were canceling the class, and Guruji insisted, no, there is no cancellation of class. This is the only joy I have. And he also refused to take painkiller. I do not recommend anybody to do that, because it's painful. But he had his own, like this, let me experience this pain and see what it does. And then he's teaching us, and sometimes he's not able to control the amount of pain. And then other times it's just completely we are flowing. So it's just about the switch of the mind going out of the body consciousness versus and then the mind coming back to grasp the body. Clearly see the conflict of the telos, that when the telos is gone beyond the body and we are doing something that is precisely doing philosophy, then our corporeal being, the condition that we are in, becomes futile in retrospective to all the events in the world. There is evil out there. I'm not denying that. There is limitation. But when we go to the core of our own experience, as Bernardo said about self-experience or subjective experience being at the core, that within that core, there is yet to manifest embodiedness. There is yet to manifest otherness. There is yet to manifest all these constructions of nationalities and all the other religion and all these concepts. And so in that basis, we have a choice, we have a freedom to embody particular pain and to go through it, or to somehow give another telos, another purpose, to live life. Life is full of suffering. I'm not denying that. But somehow the freedom the subject has is to be happy. And happiness is not just about ahaha fun. Happiness is about finding meaning in the world. and doing something in the world, in spite of all that is there, in spite of the evil that is out there. So being able to do a small thing that and we can always say what does it make a difference? So there's so much of suffering happening in the world. That's a different topic. The real thing is about our finite ability. Within that finite ability to do and to think, we are able to do the right thing. We have the freedom to think correctly, and so that is where the cyber soteriology comes to play. That it's not about being infinite in all the modes of that self-recognition, being in that absolute totality. It's about finding our own limited modes of becoming and recognizing within that limitedness. And limitedness is ingrained with suffering. Recognizing within suffering the modes of higher telos, fulfillment, upliftment. We can uplift others. We can, if not the others, we can uplift ourselves. To face this death is horror, and but not to be horrified is your freedom, and that is the joy. That's it. To conquer death. This is what we are able to do. This is what doing philosophy has allowed us to do. We recognize death an immediately given thing. I mean, coming from the Saivite perspective, we worship Kali, the goddess of death, Mahakal, the god of death. And so we are not denying, we are not running away. We are trying to bring it as close as possible. But then we are not sitting pathetically. We are doing philosophies. That is itself fulfilling to us. So I would not want to go into nitty-gritty pointing of what limitations could be in each of us, like our thinking. And I know the future hold for us like more thinking and more reflection. And so the fundamental thing, like I would like to have a last point, is Devi Uvach. The text begins with the questioning. Shaivite text, they start with questioning. And so the absolute itself is dialogical. So there is no being without a dialogue. So therefore our being itself is wrapped within this primordial dialogue of being that bifurcates itself in the mode of question and answer. And that is the only way we recognize reality. We meaning those two, questioning and answering aspects. So they are within ourselves. I'm questioning, I'm answering myself, or then sometimes we have our friends questioning or answering. So this is a constant, eternal dialogue in having a deeper realization. But what is this answering? It's not just some words. It's about feeling each other's. It's about empathy. That is the core of dialogue. It's the love. That's the core of dialogue. It's not just I have these few words and then I have some type of rebuttal to those words. There is no dialogue there. There's just some kind of this chatter. The chatter didn't go to the level of dialogue. There's no mutual, deeper recognition of each other's being, of value, of the capacity to express the singularity in potentially all the possible forms. So that's where I would like to go back to the swatantriya, freedom. Even pain is my own pain, and I would not want that to be taken away. When one of my relatives, I was just a small boy, one of my relatives had neither hands nor legs, even his nose top was fallen, all this particular disease problem. And I used to think, what is the point of living, which is a very cruel way of thinking, but from the perspective of that person, his physical conditioning was subordinate to him just being in the world. It didn't matter what physical condition he was in, So there is always this desire to be, and what happens when people have the desire to terminate to be? That's something I do not know, because that is only given. The freedom is the freedom to be, because as long as you exist, you have the choice to not be. When you do not exist, you do not have choice to be. Being allows you the freedom to be and not be. Non-being doesn't give you any freedom, and freedom is the essential nature of being. Therefore, you exist. I would like to stop at that. Thank you.
I think that's a beautiful conclusion to what's been, I think, a really productive conversation. That, the very nature of the universe, consciousness is dialogical. It's getting to know itself. And so in some way, what we're doing here is replicating, recapitulating that very nature of reality, which is through dialogue, through interaction, to get to know who we are, what all this is. And so I want to thank Amir for his time and his organization effort with Reality in Mind. That entire group has been fantastic. Thank you to the Vimarsha Foundation for showing up. Thank you to Bernardo, and thank you to Professor Timalsina for this dialogue. It's been a really wonderful one, and hopefully more to come.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks so much.
Thank you. Obviously, Ravi will send an email out with details about Vimarsha if anyone wants to follow this philosophy and also the practices that are taught by Sthaneshwar to experience this directly. We'll send out those links. We have a weekly meeting with Bernardo Kastrup next week with Rupert Spira, so you can find that, and also we'll email links to that. And then we said we'd also mention a book that's coming out, Sthaneshwar, that you have written. We'll put that in the email as well with links to what that is. So thank you, everyone. Thank you, Ravi.